Hello, everybody, and welcome to Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and I'm going to answer a question many people ask. How did we get here? And when I say here, I mean the fast food industry, where beef has become the predominant food ingested by the American public. It has an amazing history that evolved as technology progressed. By diving into the secret history of meat, we can view how our relationship with the land and agriculture changed between the late 1800s until now. For centuries before the late 1800s, pork was the main meat eaten by people. Cows were not used for beef very often. Their milk was far more valuable because it makes cheese, butter, or you can drink the milk itself. Chickens provided eggs, and although eating chickens was more common than eating cows, eggs were the main reason for raising chickens. Pork was the dominant meat product for Americans and people all over the world. Pork tastes much better heavily salted than beef does. However, there was one disadvantage with hogs. They could be driven for long distances, but did not do well over prolonged distances. Thus, hogs were butchered locally, with one exception being Cincinnati, which was nicknamed Porkopolis because of its assembly line-like process of butchers butchering hundreds of hogs daily. The city's access along the Ohio River allowed for the river transportation of the hogs to the city. Beef had a huge disadvantage as to why it was not consumed regularly. It was hard to preserve without refrigeration, and in general, people did not like salted beef. If Americans did eat beef, it was slaughtered locally and kept at a butcher's heavily refrigerated storehouse, and people would come buy it as needed and for the most part eat it that same day. As refrigeration became better, so did the rise in people eating beef. The advantage of cattle was that they could be driven for long distances, and in the 1880s more than half of the nation's cattle resided west of the Mississippi River. Long cattle drives brought about the era of the cowboy, to move cattle from the western plains to the slaughterhouses of the Midwest, but the cowboy era did not last long because of the reasons we will get to quickly. Traditionally, at 5 or 6 years old, cows would be driven to the Midwest, where a stock feeder would purchase them and fatten them on corn. With the increase in land prices in the Midwest, like in Iowa and Nebraska in the late 1800s, stock feeders sought to increase their profit and start buying steers at 2 years old to begin fattening them. One of the most significant reasons for people switching to beef was refrigeration, as stated earlier, but the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, beef grading system of 1927 altered what kind of beef people wanted. It stated that the higher the fat content, the better the beef quality. This put pressure on stockmen to feed cattle as much grain as possible in order to make more money from selling the fatty product. This in turn grew the demand for the grain being produced in the American Midwest. Sorghum is a staple of animal feed, and technological advancements moved towards growing more to keep up with the demand for animal feed. This led to better forms of irrigation and a substantial jump in fertilizer around World War II. No longer were farmers constrained by the forces of nature. Now they could grow crops in dry areas with little soil nutrients because those could be worked around through irrigation and synthetic fertilizers. This led to an entire change to how farming was done. Before, cattle raisers would grow alfalfa and grain to feed their animals, and the manure from the animals would go to fertilize the fields. Now, the farmers chose either to be at the agricultural end of the system or the animal end, further separating the two areas. To speed up the process of fattening cattle, antibiotics and hormones were added to the animals in the stockyards. The steady dose of medicine promoted growth and also gave farmers the ability to confine massive numbers of animals, not just cattle, but pigs and chickens as well, together without the worry of contagious diseases. The use of antibiotic feed additives skyrocketed, increasing from 490,000 pounds in 1954 to 1.2 million pounds in 1960 to roughly 9 million pounds in the mid-1980s. By the 1990s, animals consumed 30 times the amount of antibiotics used by humans. The introduction of the hormone estrogen to the feedlots contributed to the quick weight gain and fattening of cattle to meet the USDA beef scale of the fattiest meat. To further maximize profits, like Ford's assembly line, the meatpacking companies created a disassembly line, where one person had a specific job in taking apart each section of meat. This changed the way beef was shipped. No longer did packing locations ship sides of beef, which were awkwardly shaped. Now they created boxed beef, which allowed to transport more beef already processed to stores, taking out the need for hometown butchers. Now, to the biggest factor in the rise of beef past the beloved pork in the minds of Americans, the fast food hamburger. Although we can trace the American hamburger possibly to Delmonico's restaurant in New York City in the 1830s, which advertised a Hamburg steak, most likely the hamburger known to us today traced back to the 1921 and White Castle, who advertised the first fast food burger. They catered to a working class clientele, opening up near factories with the slogan "Buy 'em by the sack." However, it was not until the 1950s that beef took over. It was the rise of fast food in the form of the iconic McDonald's. Ray Kroc visited a San Bernardino burger bar. He bought the franchise from the two McDonald's brothers. In 1955, Kroc opened up his first restaurant in the suburbs of Chicago. One of his biggest inventions was creating a bland hamburger. That way, it could appeal to a wider audience and, more importantly, children. To take that a step further, Ronald McDonald the Clown was created to sell burgers to children. In a 1986 survey, 96% of children could identify Ronald McDonald, with only Santa scoring higher in the survey. His brand of advertising had worked. Not only did Kroc advertise to children, but he methodically opened up franchises near highways and in close proximity to suburbs. The suburbs, growing exponentially in the 1950s, led him to advertise burgers to, as he would call them, overworked mothers, who could save 2 hours in the kitchen and feed a family of 4 for $5 by visiting his establishment. Not only did this raise beef to the #1 meat consumed by Americans, but by 1972, the company became the largest meal-serving organization in the nation and the world's largest beef buyer, relying on the slaughter of 3 million cattle each year in the United States alone. This is what drove meat packers to fatten cows faster and use hormones and antibiotics in their animals. Additionally, shortly before the first McDonald's, the USDA clearly defined what a hamburger was, and it could only contain ground beef and beef fat. This meant that there could be no adding of other animal fat to keep the burger from falling apart, which further incentivized beef producers to fatten their cows. The story of the chicken runs similar to that of beef, where before the 1930s, chicken was less popular because of its dryness, and most people ate sterile old chickens because the young chickens would be used for their eggs. The broiler industry introduced Americans to modern chicken eating as we know it. The market for broilers boomed during World War II as the government's Food for Freedom program urged Americans to eat more chicken and leave the beef and pork for the troops. In 1968, Frank Perdue somewhat took the lead on making his and by default other chickens more appetizing to the American public by investing in advertising and feeding his chicken xanthophyll, derived from marigold petals, to turn their skins from white to yellow, making them better looking and tastier. To make the disassembly line more efficient, all the birds needed to be relatively the same size, so poultry farmers began to manipulate their birds to grow bigger breasts and thighs than normal chickens, and to reach the slaughtering weight in half the time, just 7 weeks. I hope this video helps you understand the historical roots of meat in the United States and how the meat on your breakfast, lunch, and dinner plates came to be. Because if you lived in the mid-1800s, your diet would have been quite different, and that difference stems from the advancement in technology that made other meats more appetizing, broilers for chicken and refrigeration for beef, which allowed for cattle to become the most consumed meat, outpacing the pig by the mid-20th century. It was McDonald's and other fast food restaurants that solidified beef at the top of consumers' lists. Just a side note, I guess I deviate from the American norm, and some of that is being a Southerner, where pork remained a staple of the American diet for longer than in other places. I would much rather have a ham dinner than a steak dinner, but that's just me. I hope this made the development of the American meat industry more clear and that you learned something. Thank you all, and have a great day.